Hello, dear listeners. This is Kathleen Langone, and welcome to the People Hidden in History podcast series. This is episode 14, and my second episode about a fascinating person from the 1700s. You are going to learn about Flora MacDonald, who lived 1722 to 1790, and who played a role in two different revolutions. First in Scotland and later in North Carolina during the Revolutionary War. She was most famously known for hiding Charles Edward Stuart, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, to protect him from being captured by government troops after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and of course putting her own life at risk. And later, she and her husband, through the offer of land in North Carolina, arrived there just before the Revolutionary War and ended up on the British side. But through all of these adventures, she shines as an amazing woman and a fierce supporter of various causes. And for those fans of the Outlander series, Flora MacDonald is featured in Season 6, Episode 5, so yet another reason to learn about her. You will hear about MacDonald from Jim Ambuske, Ph.D., well-versed in historical studies focusing on the American Revolution, Scotland, and the British Atlantic world. For more details on Jim's background and contact information, please refer to the episode description. Before you hear this interview, I also want to inform my listeners that there is now a website for this series, and the link is in the episode description. You can connect with me through the contact page at that website or through the other listed social media sites. A quick clarification note. You're going to hear references to the Jacobite Rebellion, and Jacobite comes from the Latin name Jacobus for James Francis Edward Stuart, who tried to regain the British throne. So grab a cup of the beverage of your choice, coffee, tea, whatever, and sit back and listen to the history of this woman and her involvement in two different revolutions. I'd like to welcome Jim Ambuske to the People Hidden in History podcast series. We're going to learn about a fascinating woman today. Her name is Flora MacDonald, and her life intersected many key points of history in the 1700s, both in Scotland and in the American colonies, actually during the Revolutionary War. Jim, start by telling us where Flora's life started out. We'll go from there and then go forward.
Well, first of all, Kathleen, thanks very much for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. As you said, rightly, Flora MacDonald is one of the more fascinating characters in the 18th century, and her world spans both Scotland and America. And she comes from an island called South Uist in Scotland. That's where she is born, is eventually a resident on the Isle of Skye, and as I'm sure as we'll talk about, eventually migrates to North Carolina on the eve of the American Revolution. And her life spans revolutions in two senses, both the Jacobite Rebellion of the mid-18th century, the final attempt by the House of Stuart and their loyalists to reinstall themselves on the British throne, and then in the American Revolution, where she and her husband are loyalists and side with the British state, ironically in some ways, in trying to preserve King George III's authority in North America.
That's great. Her birth, she was sort of middle class. Do I describe that correctly?
Well, you would probably describe it as middling gentry. And so there's not quite a middle class as we would understand it in the 18th century. And so she and her husband, eventually her husband, Alan MacDonald, are what we would call the minor gentry, the middle gentry. But she's born into a world in South Uist where already have some prominence in terms of her family's position in the social order and in terms of managing lands and things like that. And then when she marries Alan MacDonald in the 1750s, he is of a more prominent position where he is essentially the chief estate manager for Sir Alexander MacDonald, who is his clan chief. And he has oversight of Sir Alexander's lands and is in charge of assigning what are called tax, essentially leases, to tenants, and he's in charge of collecting that revenue. And so he has got a pretty important position in clan society, in Highland clan society, and Flora as well as a consequence.
So she sort of marries up by marrying him, right, to some degree?
Yeah, they're kind of on the same level in a sense, but Alan's got a pretty powerful position within the way that Highland society is structured in this period. You know, if we think of the Highlands, right, it almost immediately comes to mind tartans and kilts and things like that and bagpipes, but also the Highland clan. And the way the clan society works still in this period is a kind of feudalistic type society, which there is a clan chief, and there's a family that surrounds him and relatives of his. And then there are certain orders of clan society. And Alan MacDonald, who Flora marries, is, as I said, one of those key figures who's in charge of helping to manage the clan lands and overseeing tenants and things like that. So they are in a pretty prominent position by the 1750s and are hoping to ascend further in this society and become economically and socially more prominent than they already are.
That's a great explanation. And I think I understand so much better the feudal system and how the clans operated at that time. I want to go back just a little bit of time. Now, she married MacDonald in 1750, but let's talk about the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Now, was that the last battle of the Jacobite Revolution?
That is the last major battle, and for all intents and purposes, the last battle of the final Jacobite Uprising. Just very briefly, the Jacobite Uprising of the 1740s was an attempt by those loyal to the House of Stuart to reinstall a member of the House of Stuart on the British throne. In the early 18th century, after Queen Anne died, and she was the last Stuart ruler, the British had to find a successor to Queen Anne. They were not keen to find someone who was Catholic. They wanted a Protestant successor to Queen Anne. And so the Elector of Hanover, George I, became King of England, and subsequently George II, and then our buddy George III in the American Revolution. But in 1745, there was an attempt to depose George II and put the would-be James III back on the throne. And that effort was led by his son, Charles Edward Stuart, who we know more commonly as Bonnie Prince Charlie. It was a pretty serious attempt. There had been previous uprisings in the 1690s, in 1715, and 1719, but 1745 is the major one. 1745, the Jacobites put together a very serious army led by a charismatic figure in Bonnie Prince Charlie. They win several major battles. They march to within 100 miles of London. That scares the wits out of the British government in this period. But then, for a variety of reasons, lack of supplies, dissension within the leadership ranks of the Jacobite army, lack of clear objectives of whether or not they just want to retake Scotland or they want to retake the entire British Isles, they begin to lose the advantage. They begin a strategic retreat into the Highlands. They are pursued by the Duke of Cumberland and the British army back into the Highlands. And ultimately, in April of 1746, they are defeated at Culloden, and it's quite the massacre in many ways. Bonnie Prince Charlie escapes that battle. He heads west, and Culloden is just outside of Inverness, for those who are curious. But he heads west to the islands. He is trying to get transport from Scotland to France, because if he is captured, he will probably be executed. The British Army is hunting down Jacobite loyalists, particularly the leaders, and either sending them to London or, in some cases, executing them on the battlefield. So Bonnie Prince Charlie is trying to get out, and he spends several weeks going back and forth between several of the islands and the mainland, and eventually he comes into contact with people loyal to his cause, even if they're quietly so, among them including Flora MacDonald's stepfather and eventually her father-in-law, and through a variety of happenstances and maneuvering, actually meets the prince herself and plays a key role in effecting his escape from Scotland. She actually helps disguise him as an Irish woman maidservant named Betty Burke, and manages to help secret him out and get him away from British forces pursuing him. And he does manage to escape, but Flora herself is eventually captured by the British Army and Navy and held for questioning and interrogated for some time.
Does she get imprisoned in the Tower of London at this point?
So there used to be some thinking that she was imprisoned in the Tower, maybe for a brief moment. But she is, she's initially put on board a ship that is sailing off the Scottish coast and is questioned there, and then is eventually transported to Edinburgh and then eventually to London. And there was some thinking, or there was rumor or mythology, you might say, that she was imprisoned in the Tower, but it seems less clear that that actually happened. There's no concrete evidence for it. But what was done to her, she was essentially put on house arrest for about a year until about 1747, when she was pardoned under the Indemnity Act, which pardoned a bunch of Jacobite rebels. And when she's on house arrest, she is, in many ways, a very popular figure in London. She receives the patronage of a woman named Lady Primrose, who helps collect donations on her behalf. She sits for portraits by Richard Wilson and Alan Ramsay, some beautiful portraits that still survive to us in museums in Great Britain. And so she becomes a kind of celebrated figure in the aftermath of the rebellion after it's suppressed, as the kind of caricature of the gallant Jacobite spirit that resisted British authority but ultimately was defeated, and becomes a kind of curious cultural icon in its wake.
That is fascinating. But, even to this point, she's clearly a very brave woman, very secure with herself. And it's not surprising that she got this sort of notoriety even while under house arrest.
I think so. I mean, if you read the sources from when she's interrogated, and then accounts that are written later about the rebellion itself, and then accounts that she provides to a man named Robert Forbes, who's collecting tales of the Jacobite Revolution. She's a very confident person. She's very, as you say, sure of herself. And sometimes we can romanticize that, I think, but it comes very clear in her writings, or at least the recounts of her in that moment, that people are very impressed with her. The British officers who were interrogating her aboard ship are very surprised in many ways about the poise that she shows under interrogation. And if you look at the portraits that are painted in 1747 and a couple of years after there, you see a very confident woman projected before you, someone who is not diminutive, someone who is not a pushover, but someone who can hold her own. And you can see that coming across very clearly in those portraits. And we have to consider the fact that that's what the artist wanted us to see. And so there may be some of that going on there, but
a little bit of artistic license, right?
Right. But when we pair the written sources with those visual sources, we get a portrait, no pun intended, of a person who is, as you say, very sure of herself and very confident and very poised.
So let's go forward a little bit. She is released, obviously, from house arrest. She goes back to, is it the Isle of Skye that she and her husband Alan MacDonald are living on at this point?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yep.
So they're there. And let's talk a little bit about the history before they end up immigrating to North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the social and political life in Scotland this time, and maybe how the system of the clans are changing and how this impacts Flora and her husband.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really important one, because this is a world that's undergoing a great deal of change. We talked about the fact that the clan system structures everyday life. There's a clan chief, there's the clan family, there are these middling gentry like the MacDonalds, and then there are the tenants. And it is, as we said, a kind of feudalistic system, the idea being that the clan chief will provide protection for his clansmen, and in exchange, his clansmen will provide military service, sort of at its basic. So it's all built around this notion of reciprocity. But the way that clan chiefs think about themselves and the way that clan society operates is changing. And it's changing beginning centuries before we get to this period. But essentially what is happening is that as Scotland becomes more integrated into Great Britain, as it becomes much more integrated into the British Empire, as people are taking advantages of all the empire has to offer, and all of the social, political, and economic opportunities that can be found in places like Edinburgh and London, clan chiefs are beginning to act much more like landlords, like an English-style landlord, someone who owns a bunch of land and feels no real cultural connection between him and his people, but see them as rent-paying tenants.
And there's really no loyalty there per se.
Not as they would like it, or not as they thought there was. They are still in many ways going through the motions, and in many ways they're not recognizing what's happening. But it's becoming clear as the period we're talking about develops, particularly in the second half of the 18th century. So they're becoming these kind of landlord type figures. And one of the problems they have, particularly like clan chiefs like Norman MacLeod of Clan MacLeod on Skye, is that they're spending so much time in Edinburgh or London. They are partaking in everything those cities have to offer. And what those cities have to offer are also very expensive. And so they're racking up debts. They are indebted to creditors. And so they've got to find a way to pay back what they owe. And one of the things that they do is they begin to elevate rents on their tenants on their lands in the Highlands and on the islands. And that begins to put an enormous amount of pressure on people like Flora and her husband, who are operating in that kind of middle rung of society where they're trying to manage the estate and collect the debts, but especially too on the tenants proper, who can't necessarily afford to pay their rents. They're paying some of the rents in cash, in specie, but more importantly, they're paying it in crop that'll be later sold to market. So crops like black cattle. And so you've got rents going up. You're paying rents on using agricultural products that are weather dependent. And particularly in the early 1770s, there are two very, very hard winters that wipe out cattle, wipe out crops. And so that just puts even more pressure on tenants. And so you have a society that is evolving over the long period of time from this sort of feudalistic clan society based on reciprocity, but it's then being accelerated by economic pressures, by environmental pressures, and, as we'll talk about here, I'm sure in a moment, the enticement of the American colonies to begin the world anew, as some of them said.
So at this point, things are less economically favorable for Alan MacDonald. Now, what entices him to go over to North Carolina? Is there a land grant? What is he given to entice him to go over?
There are a couple things going on here that entice Flora and Alan and their family over to North Carolina, where they eventually settle for a time in the mid-1770s. So on the one hand, you've got these economic pressures we're talking about. Alan makes a series of poor financial choices that diminish his and Flora's position even further, on top of what's already happening in terms of the clan system changing. But their immigration, which is in the 1770s, had been preceded by an earlier wave of Scots migrants who went in the 1730s and 1740s. And so in North Carolina and in New York and places like that, there were already substantial Scottish populations and family networks and connections that were informing people back in Scotland that, there's land opportunities here. You can come and you can own your own land. You don't have to pay a landlord anymore. You can get a land grant. You can buy land from someone for cheap. There's plenty of it. And you can be your own landlord. And by the 1760s and 1770s, there is a second wave of immigration that begins to develop, in part because of the changes in clanship, but also because of the perceived economic and social opportunities that one could acquire in the American colonies if they acquire land, if they can acquire their own land. So in the MacDonald's case, when they leave in 1774, they eventually they stop at a couple of properties first, but eventually Alan acquires and purchases a plantation in Anson County at a place called Cheeks Creek, about over 500 acres of land. And you can get that pretty cheap in the colonies at this point because land is quote unquote plentiful, in part because, white settlers had driven off native indigenous peoples in this part of the world. And so they're claiming title to that land. There is a land grant system process, and some Scots try to band together to acquire huge tracts of land. And so sometimes you could acquire by land grant, but oftentimes you could acquire by purchase as well.
I think one of the things I want to highlight is the extensive Scottish colonies there are in, which is still, of course, the British colony up and down the 13 colonies. Mm-hmm. And that'll play a part when we talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War, that they played a role there that I wasn't aware of. So that's very interesting. And I think, like you had told me before, Jim, their perspective, they came over in 1774, they're not particularly concerned or alarmed about what they see as the seeds of the revolution. They don't maybe think it's going to come to a full war. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, people were aware that there were disturbances in the colonies. I've seen some literature that says, or some historians have said, well, Scots migrants weren't that aware of what was happening. I have a different take, in part because some of the letters I've seen where it is clear that there is an awareness of disturbances in places like Boston and New York over the Stamp Act and other things, in part because of these familial networks and family and friend networks that are exchanging letters back and forth across the Atlantic. So there is some awareness of what's happening. But there's no sense, even amongst the people who are causing, quote unquote, a lot of the trouble, that this is an independence movement. This is at this point before the outbreak of the war, and really before early 1776, the dispute with Britain is the end goal of that dispute with Britain is to try to get the British to back down so that the American colonists can remain in the British Empire. And one of the attractive things that Flora MacDonald and Allen and the other Scots who resettle in North Carolina is that they can go to North Carolina and still be British and still take advantage of the trappings of the British Empire. So they're aware of, to some degree, of what's going on, but it's not overly concerning, in part because it doesn't affect them really, because they're arriving in ports like Wilmington in North Carolina or in New York. But then in both cases, if you're in New York or if you're in North Carolina, you're probably headed to the backcountry where there are concentrations of Scots you can settle with. And those seem far removed from the more troublesome urban environments that seem to be making the news in the 1760s and 1770s.
And I think you used that term before, the Boston hotheads, right?
Exactly. Exactly. It's, and a lot of Southern colonies are sympathetic to what's happening in Boston in terms of the desire to get the British to back down. Most Americans aren't too keen on taxation without representation, but they are, and particularly among the Virginia gentry, they're kind of worried that the Bostonians will take it a little too far and cause much more trouble than it's worth, instead of trying to find some kind of common ground with the British. So yeah, there's Samuel Adams. He's probably more famous for his beer right now than he as a revolutionary, but he was one of those, I guess you could call hotheads, who was leading the charge in what some thought were unproductive or unhelpful ways.
So let's go to 1776. And we'll talk about Allen MacDonald's involvement in the war. And then can you talk also about, I guess they were organized Scottish militia, talk about them, because there are these established rather large Scottish colonies, and they had their own militia, if you will, and the role that Allen played. Yeah,
so the Allen and Flora settle in North Carolina in 1774, and they live pretty, I guess, normal life, you might say, for folks who just immigrate in this period for about a year until the Troubles break out. They've got that place at Cheeks Creek. They have orchards. Two of their sons are with them. They have indentured servants and a grist mill. And so they're maybe well on their way to establishing a new life in the colonies. But then, of course, in April of 1775, there's the engagement at Lexington and Concord. Actually, their son, Randall, who's in the Royal Marines, is injured and wounded at that battle. And what happens in that aftermath of that battle is that people begin to choose sides. the royal governors, like here in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, and then in North Carolina, Josiah Martin, begin trying to find men loyal to the crown to raise regiments and to appeal to settlers to side with the king's forces. Allan MacDonald, who's in Anson County, begins to try to raise a regiment amongst the Scotch settlers. And it's very enticing to people like Governor Martin and ultimately British authorities in London to try to raise regiments amongst Highlanders who have settled in New York and North Carolina. And part of their thinking is that because they are particularly clannish by nature, at least that's the perception of it, that they will band together and fight for the crown. And so Allan manages to raise a regiment. Part of what he's doing also is he wants to build on the good relations he's been establishing with Governor Martin. Allan is an interesting figure in part because he always seems to have an angle, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And so part of what he's doing, I think, is genuine loyalty to the crown. You know, it's ironic. It seems to be ironic in some people's minds that Scots who were participants in the Jacobite rebellion would then turn around and remain loyal to George III. But what they're doing is they're defending the empire that made their immigration and ultimately their land possible. And so Allan is in part doing that out of loyalty to the king, raising some men, and then is probably doing it as well to gain social advantage in what they hope will be the restored order once the rebellion is suppressed. So he and about 1,000 men eventually join up with British forces. They are part of a larger force that confronts a nascent, I guess you could say, part of the Continental Army in February of 1776 at a place called Morris Creek Bridge. The Highlanders are not well supplied. They're not well armed. They don't have enough weapons for everybody. And they are very swiftly defeated at that battle, very, very quickly. Allan is taken prisoner. He is taken prisoner, is initially held in Halifax, North Carolina, and then is eventually put in jail in Philadelphia for a few years. And so the promise that Flora and Allan thought they would achieve or that they could reach by immigrating to North Carolina very quickly turns upside down. As the war breaks out, Allan and his men are defeated. He is imprisoned, and then Flora and her family are essentially trapped in a colony with patriot, I guess you could say, marauders all around them, ransacking and pillaging people who they perceive to be disloyal to the American cause.
So at this point, things do not proceed too well for Flora. She is basically alone on their estate. Does she have any children with her at this point? Now, obviously, some of her children are grown, but are there any younger children with her at this time?
Yeah, she's got, they have 7 children total by the time they immigrate in 1974. Their oldest daughter, Annie, is married, and she and her husband go with her parents to North Carolina. They leave their younger daughter, Fanny, in Scotland, and then they have a number of sons. John, who stays in Scotland and is under the tutelage of one of their good friends who is a lawyer in Edinburgh. Randall, who we talked about, who's in the Royal Marines, and then James and Alexander, who are with their parents on the plantation in North Carolina, and then a son, Charles, who's actually in the Bengal Army in Bombay. And so when the hostilities break out, Annie is there with her husband. Alexander and James are there with their parents, and Alexander and James go with their father to become part of this loyalist force that's ultimately defeated at Morris Creek Bridge.
So we have Flora again on her homestead. It's a very chaotic time. And, she is at risk, if you will, from people maybe coming to confiscate her property, et cetera. And Jim, if you could talk about that and then what happens the next couple of years.
You're right to describe it as a very chaotic time. And we tend to think about the American Revolution, of course, in some ways rightly as the founding of the United States. And so it's part of our founding mythology, but it's very much a violent civil war, particularly in the South. So it is very chaotic. It's very uncertain. And Flora is essentially trapped in North Carolina from the outbreak of the war in 1975 through 1778. And there are patriots who are taking retribution on people they perceive to be loyal or to the crown or who are in fact loyalists. And so Macdonald's homestead is ransacked and pillaged, and property is taken from them. So, and that's happening on one level. And then like on a larger state level, one of the things that begins to happen after the Declaration of Independence and beginning in 1777 is that states begin to confiscate loyalist property, North Carolina among them. And confiscation is a legal tool that states use to take property they perceive from people they perceive to be guilty of treason. And so once the Americans, or once the Patriots at least, start to think of themselves as an independent nation, they begin to do what independent nations do and punish people they perceive to be disloyal to their state or their nation. And property confiscation is a very powerful legal weapon in the arsenal to do that. And so what you do is you take the property, the state takes the property, they sell that property, and they use the proceeds for their own benefit. And so this is happening in North Carolina. It happens to the MacDonalds. The state takes the property, they sell it, and they use it to fund the Patriot War effort. And, during this time, Flora is, and her family are trying to, stay alive, essentially. They're still in North Carolina. They're still living with relatives and things of that nature. But eventually she gets permission from the Revolutionary Patriot government to go to New York, where her husband now is, in 1778. Allen, as we had said, had been captured after the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. He had been imprisoned in Philadelphia. He was eventually exchanged for British officers in 1777 and allowed to go to New York, where he and Flora reunite in 1778. And so there is a bit of a reunion, and eventually Allen secures for Flora passage aboard a ship that goes to London by way of Nova Scotia, and she eventually makes it back to Great Britain in the middle of the war.
So Flora is on her way back to Scotland, I assume. What's going on with her husband? Is he still back in the colonies?
He's still in the colonies. Eventually he's in Nova Scotia and he becomes part of what's called the 84th Highland Regiment, which is composed of Highland immigrants. So he's in Nova Scotia for the rest of the war. He eventually gets a land grant from the Crown in Nova Scotia for his service. But unfortunately, his two of their sons have a less fortunate fate. Randall, who we talked about being at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he is unfortunately on a vessel that the British had captured from the French during a battle in 1782. But then in transit back to Great Britain, that ship is caught in a hurricane and is lost at sea, and Randall is lost at sea. And Alexander is lost at sea as well. The circumstances of his demise are less clear, but there are some really heartbreaking letters where Flora is back in Scotland by this point, and she has not heard from Alexander for a long time. And, eventually she says, I can only presume at this point that he is lost at sea. And it's so they kind of come to a very tragic end. It's a reflection of just how much the war took from them in many real and very personal ways.
Describe their life back in Scotland. And I think she only lives, another 11 years? Did she die in 1790?
That's correct. Yes. It's reflective of the kind of journey that they had gone on since the 1750s, where 1750s were a moment of promise into the 1760s, where it looks like Allen is going to make a prosperous life for them, notwithstanding the disruptions that are taking place. But then there's a kind of a low moment when they realize they have to go to North Carolina if they want to have any kind of chance at prosperity. They arrive in North Carolina for a year, hoping to build this new life, only for the American Revolution to break out and, in a sense, rob them of that potential promise. And when they make it back to Scotland, they have a kind of uncertain existence. When Flora gets back initially by way of London, she's living back on Skye for a time with her daughter at Dunvegan Castle. Their financial situation is not great. She's in poor health. She had broken an arm while she was in the colonies, and that had not really healed properly. She was suffering from rheumatism. And as I said, the financial situation was was not as it once was. She's still enjoying some notoriety. People know who she is because of what had happened during the 1740s. And there is renewed interest in her during the publication of James Boswell's journal about his journey to the Western Isles of Scotland with Samuel Johnson. That journey had taken place in 1773, but the volume wasn't published until 1785. So it's an uncertain time. And once Alan comes back from the colonies, he decides he can't really make a go of it in Nova Scotia, comes back to the colonies, and he, like many other loyalists, submit a claim to the British government for compensation for their losses. There's something called the American Loyalist Claims Commission that Parliament sets up in 1783, and it's designed to evaluate property losses from loyalists and provide them with some kind of meaningful compensation. And so Allen had submitted a claim to the Claims Commission for £1,300. That's what he valued their farms at in North Carolina, and then another £300 for the expense of raising those men to fight for the king. And he submits this in 1785, but they only get £440 at the end of the day after the adjudication process. So nothing to sneeze at in terms of money in those days, but considerably less than they had hoped for. But here's a really fascinating thing that happens. It's kind of widely known that Flora is in desperate financial straits. Of course, she is known for her role in the Jacobite Rebellion and somewhat less for the American Revolution, but more prominently because she has became a kind of cultural icon in Scotland and eventually in Britain for her role in the rebellion. Late in her life, in 1789, the Prince of Wales arranges for her to have a £50 pension for the rest of her life. Now, part of the fun part of this story is that he doesn't allocate this pension until 1789, which is a year after Bonnie Prince Charlie died. And so the pretender's son is dead. So now he's going to give one of the people who helped him escape a nice allowance for the rest of her life. Her life only lasts another year, but there's just this kind of very strange full circle where she is involved in one of the biggest plots to overthrow the Hanoverian line of kings in Great Britain. She goes to America to settle there and is a part of the effort to defend the king's authority, at least her family is. And then at the very end of her life, she gets a pension from one of the members of the family who, if the Jacobite rebellion had succeeded, would never have been anywhere near the crown at all.
What this speaks to me is that she was very respected. She was clearly a very strong woman. And like you're saying, somewhat of notoriety. I think if she were around in this day and age, she'd be all over Instagram. That's how I would envision this. But no, this is such a fascinating story. Jim, is there anything left of their homestead in North Carolina or a marker of anything? Do we know physically where that homestead was today?
I'm not quite sure if there's any physical markers of their homestead. We know where it was. For a long time in the 19th century, it was speculated that it was at a couple of different places. And I should say in the 19th century, particularly among what we would say early American historians, but particularly historians of North Carolina, there was a lot of interest in her and trying to figure out where this site was. And they eventually, through various sources that had been discovered in the archives, figured out that it was at Cheeks Creek. Now, in terms of relics, that's another tale. We know that some of her silver plate actually ended up in a museum in North Carolina, but her tea set ended up by various means. It's not clear to me how, but it's currently at Red Hill in Brookneal, Virginia, and Red Hill was the final home of Patrick Henry. And so her tea set is in their museum, and I've seen it, and it's gorgeous. And it's still, again, it's unclear how it got there. Probably what happened is that when she was making ready to leave North Carolina, they probably sold a bunch of stuff, and it that stuff dispersed everywhere, and by various happenstances manages to end up in a museum for the silver plate, but also the tea set at Red Hill. So there are some last vestiges of Flora MacDonald in America that survive today. And a few years ago, an unknown portrait of her was discovered in Florida, of all places. So go figure.
We'll try to include one or two of her portraits, certainly when we post the podcast. I think that would be great. And again, what impressed me is all the research that you did and others have done, with letters, and because I think there's a lot filled in on this fascinating life about her. Do you have any final comments on her, or from my listeners, things that you would like to highlight?
I would just say that Flora MacDonald, for me, highlights just how complex the era of the American Revolution was. I think it's very easy to get caught up in people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, to get caught up in the Declaration of Independence, and to celebrate events like the Battle of Lexington or Concord or the Battle of Yorktown. But for people like Flora MacDonald, the Revolution was a very viscerally experienced thing, and she lived, and her life represents what historians might describe as the transformation of the British Empire in in the second half of the 18th century. She witnessed and participated in one revolution, became caught up in another, and ended up returning to Scotland in the mid-18th or late 18th century as the subject of a king whose initially her family tried to overthrow. And if that doesn't describe historical change, doesn't describe historical irony, doesn't describe historical contingency, I don't know what does.
Jim, I wanted to thank you so much for being part of the People Hidden in History podcast series. Certainly, Flora is a person to me that was hidden in history. I did not know about her, and I learned so much more about the details of the Revolutionary War and the settlements of the Scottish at that time.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about Scots and the American Revolution, and delighted to speak with you and your listeners. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks so much for listening to the incredible and dramatic story of Flora MacDonald. I truly enjoyed talking with Jim and his blending key historical events with her life. As mentioned earlier, more details on his background and contact information can be found in the episode description. For those listening right now, whether this is your first episode or maybe you've listened to many, I want to thank all of my listeners who have enjoyed these hidden historical figures. Please do listen to the other episodes, which now cover the 1600s through to the 1960s. And do subscribe to the series, and feel free to contact me through the People Hidden in History website contact page. Thanks, folks.